Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. This is Mark Turi, and today we are going to go over a PowerPoint, which is quite common on what we do on, of course, on Saturday evening for my time, or afternoon, late afternoon for your time. But today we're going to do a PowerPoint presentation on exploring the ideas of libertarianism and anarchism. We've been doing this every couple Saturdays now, or for the past 2 Saturdays, and now is the third Saturday. So last week we talked about socialism and Marxism, and the week before we talked about liberalism and conservatism. So this time we're going to go all the way to the other end and do libertarianism and anarchism. We're going to break down those ideas, give those definitions, and explore some of the intricacies and nuances, schools of thought wherein. And yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who watched my live on Wednesday, which of course was on the 11th of December. Um, that was a very special episode, a tribute to a friend in our sort of ex slash critic of Scientology community named Doug Scott Kramer. So thank you for being around for that. I got some really nice messages. So thank you for for those individuals and those people who were kind enough to leave your memories, your thoughts, and your well wishes. Yeah, just very, again, very thankful to have been able to do that, and yeah, very thankful for for everyone's comments. Again today, just gonna hang out and with me and do another PowerPoint presentation. I will, of course, make these announcements afterwards, after we're done, towards the the final moments of our stream here. But also letting you know that on Wednesday, which is the 18th, so the following Wednesday after this week, next Wednesday, we are going to be talking about the different like varieties and types of history, which is a second part of a history based also PowerPoint that I did a couple months ago. And in this one, we're going to be talking about like what is political history, social history, business history, economic history, historiography, and a little bit of stuff that we touched on just a little bit before in the Karl Marx philosophy of history live again, which I did, recently, just within a couple of months ago. And then after that, we're going to go on for our holiday break. I don't think there'll be too many people making content then, so I'm just going to, give somewhat of a rest until that. Make sure we have a good holidays, of course, and nothing too distracting. So I'll sort of take the break. And then I'll come back in the New Year's. I think I mentioned before, and I probably will mention it again on the 18th, on Wednesday, this upcoming Wednesday. But I may have a schedule change. It won't be too dramatic or too um, terrible. It won't be terrible. But yeah, I'll just let you know all about that in probably by Wednesday, and that'll just be effective as of the new year and onward. So, not much to say in the realm of small talk or even for house cleaning, so to speak. As I said, just look out for the announcement on my schedule change for next year coming soon. I'll give more details on Wednesday, and then we'll follow up in the new year. But other than that, again, it's been kind of cold here. Today's temperature was probably in the mid 30s Fahrenheit, which is just over zero, maybe 1 or 2 degrees Celsius. And it's been raining. It's been a little wet. It's been a little cold. It's been a little windy. No snow, thankfully. That happened 2 Fridays ago. There was quite a bit of snow, as I mentioned, but nothing since the past couple weeks, other than kind of crummy weather. The temperature is supposed to go up, but it's also supposed to rain more for the next week. So on one hand, it won't be as cold. It'll be in the maybe low to mid 40s. So probably around anywhere from 6 to 8 degrees Celsius, which is still pretty warm for this time of year. Um, but on the other hand, it will probably be raining a lot more and wet, which is always not my favorite. Plus, of course, the wind, which I don't like, especially cold wind. But that's about all. So there's really nothing too much else to say. I'll probably have a lot more to talk about after the break is over and we get back in the new year, as I'm sure you all will as well. And I look forward to knowing what you all did for the holidays and New Year's in just a few weeks from now. And that's it. So I will probably just get into the the slideshow actually right now. Um, so this is our slide. This is our my PowerPoint, I should say, my slides for this week. And as I mentioned earlier, we have talked about now liberalism and conservatism, where we have looked at you know, things like where do rights come from? What about tradition? Is are changes better, slowly or more incrementally? We looked at the difference between classical liberalism, which believes that the government must be very minimal in order for us to have liberty, whereas social liberals would argue that having good health and good roads and good public services, including a welfare state, that makes us and gives us better liberty. So, of course, we're going to talk about libertarianism today, and we're going to put a lot of those liberal and liberty ideas to the extreme here. And then, of course, when we talked about socialism and Marxism, we talked about things like, the role of government and property and history and things like this. So, what we're going to do is look at anarchism and we're going to look at the state because, of course, there are socialist ideas in libertarianism and in anarchism, as well as capitalist ideas in both of them. And before I get into the actual slides, I just want to say hello to Power Lines, Anarchy, of course, Anarchy in the UK. It's coming sometime, maybe. If I give a wrong time, we'll stop a traffic line. Your future dream is a shopping scheme. I love the Sex Pistols. Speaking of London, here we are, Joe, Mark Postle. Hey, Mark. Hey, Chad. How are you? Chad, not Chad. Excuse me, Chad. I'm good. Hi, Irish Mart. How are you? Again, Pete's jacket is definitely more classy than this one. It's a light blue and of course and white Adidas jacket. This is just my bum around jacket. I also want to tell you too that I'm wearing the matching track, sweatpants under here, the track pants. And if you know anything about Russian culture, I look right now, I look like a gopnik, and that is something that I hold on to very dearly. And I'm sure, Joe, you know what a gopnik is. I think we've joked about it before, but I am in my gopnik gear today, and just talking about, of course, Russia, anarchy. I'm kidding. It was coincidental that I put on a tracksuit to talk about anarchism, which actually one of the most profound thinkers of anarchism was Mikhail Bakunin, who was Russian. It's all a coincidence. Um, I do have plenty of flat caps, but I don't think I have the actual flat cap. Can you describe it to me? If it's because I've got gray flat cap, I've got a blue one, and I've got a white one, which I like. When I was in London, I bought a what's it called? A coat. You saw it, Joe. It was the big coat that I was wearing. I bought that at Marks and Spencers, and I do have wear that with my flat cap, and I look like I'm straight out of London, which is not bad, I have to say. Um, Nestor Markna, or was he Ukraine? I don't know who that is. So I just remember Mikhail Bakunin and other people here. But yes, so there we go. So thank you so much, everyone. Again, we're going to explore today these two terms, and we're going to get into the definitions, the varieties, and the school of thought. I'm going to go to full screen right now, which of course means that I cannot see the chat. So after every 1 or 2 slides, I will check up on what's going on. Please, again, leave your questions, your comments, or anything else you want to say in the chat, of course. And if you have anything to add, please do so. If clarification, if I mispronounced or said something wrong, please let us know your opinion, and definitely do that. So I'm at full screen now. However, I wanted to start off with libertarianism. And of course, as you know, how I like to break down my ideas, which I did have a whole video about that a few months ago, is we got to start with the definition. And here, by the way, I've gone a little bit more out of my shell. Yes, of course, there will be definitions of these terms provided by philosophybasics.com. And I only do that because I love that website. I think it's very cool. But also, there are definitions in here that go from a broad range of actual dictionary definitions from Merriam-Webster's, as well as other political science dictionaries and so forth. So they're a mishmash. And of course, I would have to cut down some of them. So, like I always say, if you want more information and more details on any of these things, you can check out something like philosophybasics.com. Or you can go to one of the many sort of comparative politics or political science. We'll usually have textbooks. Cambridge will have one. I think it's Palgrave will have one. And so obviously you can grab those books or read them online or something to get more. But this is obviously just some basic kind of background. But first of all, what is libertarianism? Well, libertarianism, just as a whole, is a very broad spectrum of political philosophies that cascade all over the political spectrum. So there's left wing and right wing, and I'll get into those also. But there are left wing versions and right wing versions of libertarianism. But they have, of course, things in common, depending on where they are on the political spectrum. They share that they believe in essentially maximizing individual liberty, which would then minimalize the government in some way. And the result of this is to increase things like the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. In America, especially, American libertarians go very much to the freedom to bear arms, so to own weapons that would protect you and your property against government intrusion. That's also very similar in other countries. Like we have a libertarian party in Canada, there's one in the UK, and all over, so they would believe that as well. Of course, the freedom not only of religion, which is a personal liberty, but from it. So if you don't practice religion, the idea is to have the separation of church and state. You also have to have the freedom of press, freedom of ownership, and in this case, whether that's the freedom of private property or public communal property is up to where we are on the left-right political spectrum. And then what's sometimes deemed as economic freedom, which we talked about specifically when we discussed economic liberalism. So some libertarians that are more on the right tend to favor what they might call fiscally conservative or economically liberal economic policies, which usually increases deregulation. But again, if you're on the left, then that takes a different approach as well. So essentially, that is what libertarianism is. The other thing is, of course, where does libertarianism, that word, originate? What does it mean? So what is its etymology? It is a word that came from France in the 1850s, and it just means for liberty. And originally it was named, libertarianism was the name of several schools of thought in socialism, um, especially in socialist thinking, where there was no authoritarian. It was the opposite. It opposed authoritarian socialism. And this was, of course, quite popular after the 1917 Russian Revolution in Russia. And then through Europe, when the Europeans were looking at communism and communist states that were being built up after World War I, and especially after World War II, were mostly authoritarian, in many cases totalitarian, and they didn't have individual freedom and liberty. So libertarian was this new idea, which was to decentralize and make socialism more, libertarian, quote unquote. And of course, during the like 60s, I would say probably starting in the 50s to maybe the 70s, and certainly by the 80s and up till now, right-wing libertarians began when in the 70s, the libertarian parties were, founded in Canada, the US, and so forth. And I'll go through that in a few slides from now. So again, what is left libertarianism? So when we're talking about left libertarianism, we're basically looking at ideas that have strong commitment to personal liberty, but they also include an egalitarian view of natural resources. So the idea here that it's not legitimate for someone to claim private ownership of resources, and especially if it's to the detriment of others. And I'll get into the opposite of this. In the right wing, the extreme right wing libertarians would say that private ownership does extend to natural resources. And of course, left libertarianism says that each individual is entitled to an equal share of natural resources. So this would be, something where we wouldn't have private property on lakes or rivers or land or farming and so forth. So again, it goes back to some of the socialist ideas we talked about last week. Now, there are different types, of course, of left libertarianism. One of the most common ones is libertarian socialism. It is probably, again, the most popular among left-wing libertarians because it's kind of itself an umbrella term, like under left libertarianism, which is an umbrella. Then there's libertarian socialism, which kind of, they overlap because they're different types, but also there are many people who probably are on the left who call themselves libertarian socialists, probably the most popular. And this is a far left political ideology which emphasizes anti-authoritarianism. So that would be in left-wing terms, opposition to like Stalinism, Maoism, Trotskyism, Leninism, things like this. And then they're anti-capitalist and they believe in self-governments and worker self-management. Some of those things will sort of be crossed with or mirrored with things like market socialism, democratic socialism, but there's a more stress on the libertarian side in these ones. We also have social libertarians, and what's interesting about this is these are sometimes called fusionist or syncretic ideologies. These ones in this category. We're not just combining libertarian and socialism, but there's a lot of libertarians that look at social democracy, which is something I've yet to get into. But social democracy is kind of categorized as being what they have in the Nordic model. So in Sweden, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Denmark. And those countries, of course, have a capitalist market, but they have a lot of regulation on the market. They also have higher taxations to some extent. They have good unions. Sometimes unions are actually mandatory in the what are they called? The shareholders of the boards, excuse me, shareholders boards within corporations are mandated to have a union rep. They have free healthcare, free education, and some people will call that socialism, but it's really not. It used to be, but it kind of isn't anymore. And so the idea that society is actually better for liberty means you are a social libertarian, including taking what are called civil libertarian principles and adding them to social democracy. So both of those together, you get social libertarian. Then there's what's called a geo-libertarian, and the geo does not stand for geography or anything environmental. It's actually from an American economist in the 19th century. His name was Henry George. And so there is something called Georgism, which kind of sounds a little interesting. My father's name was George. his name was George, so Georgism. And it combines libertarianism with Georgism. And Henry George came up with an alternative for progressive income taxes, even though he was writing in the late 19th century before there was a progressive income tax. And what he said was essentially that land should not be a commodity that should be bought and sold. It should be belonging to everyone. And so rather than taking taxes off our consumption, which would be a sales tax, or of course off our earnings, which would be the progressive income tax or an income tax. Sometimes it's a flat rate, sometimes it's a progressive rate. He said, let's all just pay rent to sort of a communal, non-existent landlord that would be the government. And so we just all pay this single tax on land. And then that could, be a better option than a progressive tax, a flat tax, or consumption tax. And what's interesting about this is this belief of just Georgism without the libertarian part, the single land tax, had a lot of support from people all over the spectrum, including socialists like George Bernard Shaw, and also right wing economists, libertarians like Milton Friedman. So it's something that is kind of beyond politics and had a lot of socialists, left wing libertarians, right wing libertarians, conservatives, liberals, etc., either back in the 19th century, 20th century, and also today in the 21st century. And they have a lot of support that is, I guess it's a nonpartisan. Okay, so all right. Sometimes my browser freezes, which just happened. Okay, Nestor Makhno was an anarchist leader who led the anarchist faction in the Russian Civil War. Okay. Had a short-lived state, yeah, which is today Ukraine. He allied with the Bolsheviks, then fought against them. I don't agree with his politics, but yeah, fascinating figure. I did not know who that was. Now I do. Thank you to Mark Postle number 2, Joe Giuseppe. Of course, one has to be Chad because he was my first subscriber. But thank you. I appreciate that very much. Again, any details like this, please, send them in because I did not know who that was, and I'm going to look him up after this. But thank you very much. Okay, back to full screen. We have a second part here. Here are some other left-wing libertarian or left libertarian kind of ideas. One of which is called agorism, and this was founded by a gentleman named Samuel Edwin Konkin III, who was an American economist. And the ultimate goal of this is to bring about a society in which all relationships or relations between people are voluntary exchanges, which is also what we find again in some extreme versions of right wing libertarianism. It's a philosophical idea that instead of society being based on coercion, which some libertarians on the right think is taxation, or they think is even voting or whatever, or social justice, they would consider coercion because you don't really have a voluntary say in it. We have to pay taxes. Of course we do, and there's reasons why, but they have a philosophical difference. And so agorism is kind of the left-wing libertarian version of that. There was something called mutualism, and mutualism also goes over into anarchism, but it's considered to be both, like anarchism and left libertarianism. So it was largely associated with this gentleman named Pierre-Jacques Proudhon. He was very famous for calling all property theft, especially a private property. He called it theft because, of course, there is an idea that I forgot to bring up last week with Marxism, which is like if you're working in a factory and you're building toys, your labor is going in to build those toys, so you should be the one who owns those toys, not your boss. And so this kind of thing comes with mutualism. It's this idea of labor, and it's this kind of idea of having the private property of you're then sending those toys to the capitalist who's then making profit, and you're only making $1 an hour or $7 an hour or $30 an hour, but whatever. So it's this paradigm that Marxists tend to think about, which is interesting, but ultimately not something I mean, I like thinking about it, but I don't necessarily support it. However, Proudhon, who wrote a book called What is Property? As I said, he thought private property was theft. He envisioned a society where each person might possess their own means of production, whether individually or collectively, with trade representing equivalent amounts of labor. So again, mutual in the sense that we are both part. Our means of production is both us as individuals, which we would then get to keep the fruits of our labor, and then also collectively because we would have to work collectively. And then after this, there's something called neoclassical libertarianism. Sometimes people put this on the center right or the center left, but I think in this case it's actually considered and is largely today considered to be part of the sort of center left libertarian. And that's because now it combines the idea of libertarianism with social liberalism. So a lot of left libertarians are big believers in social justice. Some that believe in a reduced state still would have ideas about liberty, needing some, government services in order for us to increase that amount of social justice. And neoclassical libertarians and social libertarians are often collectively referred to as bleeding heart libertarians because they believe that the best way to do social justice is not always through the government, but through the idea of increasing liberty, while in insofar as doing so, they also have a commitment to social justice. So again, social justice can also be voluntary in a libertarian standpoint. It doesn't have to be necessarily always government. And then, of course, we're adding that libertarian kind of minimal government aspect, to this. Now we go on to the right. So what is right libertarianism or right-wing libertarianism? Well, obviously these are the libertarians that instead of I would say moving the goalpost a little bit towards like social liberalism, which has capitalism with regulation, social democracy, which has capitalism, regulation, and a lot of redistribution, and then the libertarian socialism and the libertarian left, which has a very little state, if any state, okay, and is mostly communal and egalitarian and so forth and decentralized. Uh, right wing libertarians are going to move more towards the conservative aspects of capitalism, which means less and less regulation on the market, which would still exist, and of course, less a public property, less public services, and more private property and private services. And so, really, it's right libertarianism is again a synthesis, which is a word here we'll hear a bit today, of libertarianism and right wing conservatism. So it's stressing limited government and strong capitalism, but it will differ from Christian influenced. So we learned this 2 weeks ago. There's religious conservatives and social conservatives, and it's different from it because right libertarians tend to favor secularism. So the separation of church and state as opposed to building a theocracy. So then what are some types of right libertarianism? And I think this is really interesting because these three types have to do with the size of government. Okay. And I mentioned before the Libertarian Party. So these three are I would say, the most typical or traditional, if you want to use that word, three main philosophies that one would get in the Libertarian Party. Because again, in the 70s, the libertarians took the word libertarian to and created the party to serve the right-wing libertarians. And they did that, according to them, because liberal had moved to the left, and the only word that they had available was libertarian, so they adopted that and so on. Whether or not that's true, I don't really know, but that's what they say. And so, okay, let's think about in this experiment as a thought experiment. So I want you all to just, if you're listening to this, just think in your own head of all the things that the government does today. So the government provides, for example, a lot of goods and services. So the first one is called minarchism, also called minarchy. The root word here is minimal archism, right? Minimal archism, minarchy. So think of all the goods and services that the government does today. Think of all the goods and services when you pay your taxes. When you go today, you might have public transportation, et cetera, et cetera. So think of all of them. remove every single thing that you are thinking about and only keep a state or a government in a state that exists. But minarchists think that the state should only provide for the military, police, courts, and firefighters. That's it. So everything else that you've thought about is fully privatized. That means that you have to get it from a private company. Okay. So if you were thinking of transportation, there'd be no public transportation. There might be public transportation, like there might be, or I should say, private transportation. So you could have things like Uber and Lyft. But even if there were trains, even if there were subways and metros and tubes and trolley cars and trams and streetcars and whatever, they'd all be run essentially by a private company. And you'd have to pay a monthly pass to maybe one company if there was a monopoly, but there's not supposed to. But you probably have a lot of those. So that's a minarchist, and traditionally, the minarchists is the philosophy behind the libertarian parties. That's really what they want to do. Of course, they've never really been elected. There's the one guy in Argentina right now, and there was one senator in Australia for a bunch of years that were libertarians, but in America and the UK and elsewhere, Canada, they're still a fringe party, third party. They barely get noticed. But that's essentially what they would do is they would privatize everything except for military, police, courts, and firefighters. We talked about classical liberals last time. So classical liberals will say that, okay, the government should exist, there should be a state. It should provide, they agree with the minarchists, it should provide the military, police, courts, and firefighters, but they might add certain things like hospitals, roads, schools, and even a social safety net. And their argument would be that, hey, we have to have private hospitals because, if, excuse me, public hospitals, pardon me, the government has to make public hospitals and, public healthcare and this kind of stuff because, regardless of some of the disadvantages, right? It's not this is the where some of the basic social justice thinking comes in is that like it's not okay for someone to just, die on the street or something, assuming medical care would only be private in minarchism. Talk about roads. I mean, if we only had private roads, what happens when there's an ambulance? Do they have to stop every few miles to pay a toll? And what would that look like? Only private schools, like that's not really a good system too, because then if corporations get involved or religions get involved, and so there are disadvantages to public schools, especially funding. But when public schools have a lot of funding, then they can be pretty good again in the Nordic model, kind of thing. And then a social safety net, again, it's that idea, that basic idea of the most minimal form of social justice, which is it's just not okay for people who are doing well in a society to let other people die on the street or go hungry. And so that's what a classical liberal would argue, that the government, yes, there would be a lot of things that could be privatized, but then there's these essential things like hospitals, roads, schools, the social safety net, and then they would add police, military, courts, and firefighters. But then if you're really, really extreme, you have anarcho-capitalism, which, although called anarcho-capitalism, which denotes the fact that it's a form of anarchism, most anarchists that I will talk about in a moment do not believe that anarcho-capitalists are anarchists, because most anarchists have been, especially in the 19th, 20th century, have been fiercely anti-capitalist. And so anarcho-capitalism is, to a lot of people, I guess you could say, a contradiction, or an oxymoron, if that's another word. So in this case, all goods and services, including the above examples, would be fully privatized and there'd be no state. So there'd only be a private military, which sounds horrific. Private police sounds horrific. Private courts, private firefighters, and then, of course, all private hospitals, roads, schools, and there would be no social safety net. And the screwed up thing about this is I used to know a lot of people who are anarcho-capitalists, and they're actually not evil people. I think they're dumb, and I think that they're clueless, to be honest with you. but it's not like they're doing it because they hate people. They genuinely have convinced themselves that the government is the reason why bad things happen. And if we had anarcho-capitalism, and I know this is hard to put your mind around, but if we had anarcho-capitalism, it actually would be a better society. And again, it's the same with people who we talked about with Marxism and certain versions of socialism. Last week, there's a lot of stuff that I don't agree with, but they're convinced that it would actually be better. They're not monsters, is what I'm trying to say. They're just people who, kind of think like, all privatized? Like, to me, that sounds horrific. But again, they've managed to figure out within their own headspace of how it can, be a beneficial good. And I say, okay, fine. It's never likely to happen. And the population is so small that what influence will they have? Although I do have to say, when I say all influence that they have, that president guy from Argentina also calls himself an anarcho-capitalist, but I guess his policies will remain to be seen on what he's actually doing and not doing over there. After this, we have classical libertarians. Very simple goal on here, because they're also part of the Libertarian Party, along with the other two that I mentioned, or the other three that I mentioned in the previous slide, excuse me, is that classical libertarian, the goal is just to shrink the power and to limit the government and to promote free markets. So it's almost like a very middle of the road. It's like not a very specific type. It's just kind of, yeah, they're just generally libertarian. And in general, right-wing libertarians especially, that's what they want: shrink the power of the government, promoting free markets. We then have neo-libertarians, and this is also a synthesis between neoconservatism, which, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, was a more of a war hawkish, interventionist foreign policy and more of a militaristic, expansionist democracy type of thing, like George W. Bush, John Ashcroft, Dick Cheney following 9/11. And they somehow make libertarian arguments that it's better for liberty and libertarianism to like go into places where there aren't any rights, and to make them more like us, and doing that with militaries and expansion and intervention. Okay. uh they're not my favorite, but again, it's one of those things. And then paleo libertarians is a more culturally conservative and more Christian libertarianism. They usually have views that are against abortion, and they believe in the complete privatization of education. So there's another flair there. There would be considered socially conservative in many ways, but also libertarian. And again, I don't agree with this one either, especially it says here views against abortion and privatizing education. But as you can see the through line between some of these types, where should education be state or federal, or should there even be a department at all? And that's going to be debated next year when Trump comes into power. They may get rid of the Department of Education in the United States. So who knows? With that, good luck on that one. I hope somehow some good might come out of that one, even though I am skeptical. But that's paleo libertarians. After this, we of course have anarchism. Let me just see if there's any questions here. Okay. So anarchism. So what is anarchism? Because a lot of times, this anarchy, especially, and anarchism, is brought up quite a bit. We use it very colloquially in our language. But the political philosophy, I should say, school of political thought of anarchism, um, is the rejection of compulsory government or compulsory rule, and it holds that society can and should be organized without a coercive state. So anarchism is basically a stateless society. And what anarchists will say, like, and when I get into philosophical anarchists here, and I'll just go through this. So, a philosophical anarchist contends that the state lacks moral legitimacy, that there is no individual obligation or duty to obey the state, and conversely, that the state has no right to command individuals. So, interestingly enough, I know a lot of people will then look to anarchy and think of anarchy as things like chaos and lawlessness, But again, in the anarchist philosophy, it doesn't mean that there can't be leaders or even councils or even small governments, but it is simply against a state. And there is a difference between a state and a government, although they go hand in hand. You can have non-state governments. So that's just what they would how they would argue. And again, it's a philosophical position. It might seem very impractical. It is to me, but certainly when I was a teenager listening to punk rock, I used to read anarchist thought. And of course, when I was, 16, 18, 22, I thought this was really cool and, whatever. And then I grew up a little bit, again, not to say you can't be my age or older and be an anarchist, but it's just something that, seemed to be really cool when I was listening to the Sex Pistols at 16. Then we have the term anarchy, and I know again, anarchy has this. We think of it, especially if English is your first language, even if it isn't. People will tend to think of anarchy as riots, lawlessness, looting, breaking windows, spray paint, tear gas, all this kind of stuff. And in some cases we do call that anarchy, but anarchy also comes from a Greek word, anarchos or anarchos. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but it's without rulers. And up until the 19th century, the term was generally used in positive manner to describe a coherent political belief. And only later it became pejorative. So this is when we think of anarchy, we think of those riots and tear gas, spray paint, water hoses, um, rubber bullets, and that kind of thing. We think of anarchy, lawlessness. We think of anarchy in, the wild, wild west of the United States. And that was just not the case early on. That was actually anarchy was just a short term for anarchism, which just meant, you know, no state, which was very popular again in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So next we have what is social anarchism, and there's three different schools of thought within social anarchism. In this case, the social could also mean socialism. I've heard people in the past only through terms, like not officially written down, but only through speech. I guess we again call it colloquialists, say anarcho-socialism. It's pretty much again what kind of social anarchism is. It's like socialism and anarchism together. And social anarchism, which is emphasizes again social equality, community, mutual aid, and communitarian and cooperative aspects of anarchist thought and practice. So it's the more socialistic, it's the more equal, egalitarian. Mutual aid, of course, is goes back to mutualism and so forth, and they're all kind of combined. There's also collectivist anarchists, which is a type of social anarchism which was spearheaded by Mikhail Bakunin, who advocated for the abolition of the state and also the abolition of private ownership. And instead, things would be owned collectively and controlled and managed by the producers themselves. So again, you're working in that factory making toys. Okay, you're the one who's making the toys. So should you not have a share of the profits of you making those toys? And again, this is just a philosophical argument with the division of labor and Marxist, anarchist, socialist thought, capitalist thought, so forth. Next one we have is communist anarchism, also called anarcho-communism. It's the most, very much the most radical forms of both communism and anarchism. So they promote and propose a free society composed of a number of self-governing communes with direct democracy or consensus democracy as a political organization. And they believe that in forming these communes through a federation. And normally, in this case, when we also talked about a little while ago now, when we discussed what happened when the revolution didn't happen, um, I referred to reform socialism and revolutionary socialism. This is obviously, these are revolutionaries. And in some cases, they do believe in what's called insurrectionist anarchism, which means you do go out, commit violence, because the state itself is evil. It's not a necessary evil, it's evil. And so you have to destroy it. And so a lot of violence can be sewed into anarchist thinking along with revolution, but it's not always the case. and I'll give an example of that here. So other types of anarchism include religious anarchism. Last week we talked about religious socialism and how there were many socialists who brought about, certain things in our society like universal health care and anti-poverty measures and so forth, and how we talk about the social gospel. But going one step further, there are religious people. We can see here a number of them. There are Catholic anarchists. I mentioned Catholic socialist thought last week. There's also Catholic anarchist thought. There's anarchists in Buddhism and Judaism. It says here neo-paganism, and they basically reject the state because God did not produce the state. So they believe that the state is a almost a satanic, if that's only really, I guess, or demonic, which might only again overlap with a few of these religions. But they believe that essentially the state is not legitimate, and because it wasn't a part of God's plan to have a state. So that's their idea. And one of the most famous actual Christian anarchists was Leon Tolstoy. He wrote a lot about anarchy and anarchism, in especially after the wars that he saw and so forth. The next one I mentioned about violence, but there is something called Anarcho-Pacifism. The philosopher, writer, American writer Henry David Thoreau on Walden Pond. Um, he wrote about this. Many of the transcendentalists in his day believed in a sort of a stateless, peaceful societies. Again, emphasizing the rejection of violence in order to bring about this kind of stateless society. And then there's Anarcho-Feminism, which synthesizes radical feminism and anarchism, and it opposes patriarchy, and it considers the state to be the biggest and most functioning, evil of hierarchical, patriarchal society. Let me just see here. Let me go on. Oh, yeah. And then after this, we have different types of environmental-based anarchism. So the first one is, of course, green anarchism. And of course, this has to do with both anarchy or anarchism, stateless society that has a very strict focus on protecting the environment. So in that case, no revolution, because that would be dangerous to the environment, and also living in a lot of smaller communities. We have Anarcho-Primitivism. This is one that I find fascinating, even though I also find it very unattractive. It believes that civilizations and technology inevitably lead to inequality and must be abolished. So if you do Google anarcho-primitivists, these tend to be the people that are like extreme kind of hippie people who will live, off the grid with no running water. They believe that the Industrial Revolution and technology are evils. We have to go to back to the pre-modern times. They grow their own food, and they tend again to live in sometimes in communities, but mostly by themselves, as a complete and utter rejection, I should say, of all technologies, everything modern. And again, a lot of them tend to be very like anti-vax and natural kind of stuff. And then the last one is eco-anarchism, which takes those things and then says, we need to, as a society, we need to be structured into these small eco-villages that have no more than 150 people. And so those are our, versions of anarchism and libertarianism for this week. And so I just think that these are very interesting topics. I think that I would say a lot of them are not very practical in any way, and are very unlikely, I think, to occur. But they're interesting. And the difference between a libertarian and an anarchist is usually libertarians will argue for a state. They'll maybe do the minimal state, the monarchist state, or more classical liberal, but they tend to believe in minimal intervention and minimal taxation and things like this. And then Anarchists would believe in no state at all, and even though there is some back and forth between schools, like libertarian socialists, anarcho-capitalists, and so on, it really is, they really are two different things. And so they tend to be the most extreme. So when we looked at, again, liberalism and conservatism, we looked at liberalism being a version of liberty and whether or not the government adds to that or takes away from it. We looked at conservatism, which of course has many branches, but mostly sticking with tradition, conserving social institutions that have evolved and having very small incremental changes in society. We then looked at socialism as an economic school of thought where, private property does not exist. There's only public property and debatable in some cases on personal property. And then we looked at all the different types within that. And again, government can be very authoritarian. It can be more democratic. It can be, almost non-existent or non-existent at all. And then when we looked at Marxism, we were talking more to do with society, less to do with government necessarily. We talked about media, we talked about art, we talked about all that kind of thing. And then again, following here, we have the size of government. So I think they're all interesting. I'm going to continue to do different things next year. I'm going to probably do a couple more like these where we'll do one or two political philosophies. But because I was thinking about Doug this week. Doug and I did, as I mentioned in the video, a number of different mm, videos dedicated to different religions, and I think that might actually be interesting too. If I go over like different religions and different denominations within religions, just to do something just basic, to do PowerPoints like this, and that that can be something that I'll throw in with a political idea or philosophy, and then I'll throw in like a different religion, the basics of them, if they have different denominations, what do they believe, where do they come from, and we'll go from there. So I think, I think that'll be a good thing to do. And then, yeah, if you haven't liked this video yet, please give this video a like. It helps me out. Of course, if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. I'm still at around 130 subscribers. I've got over 3,000, close to 3,500, I think, views. I'm over 400, almost 500 watch hours, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm sort of plugging along. I'm getting some pretty good traction on my Twilight Zone video, my Russian minorities video, my Germany history videos. And of course, I will, like to do more in the future. I'd like to do more next year, of course. So with all of your help and all of your support, I can. And yeah, I just appreciate everyone who's here, everyone who comes, regulars like Joe and Irish Mart and Power Lines. Guys are always here, which is really nice. And I appreciate all the thought, all the effort. Thank you again to those who watched, my tribute to Doug. And yeah, Wednesday we'll be back with different definitions of different types of history and what is social history, what is political history, what's economic history. We'll go into some of that. I'll talk a bit about some of the things I like about that stuff. We've touched on a little bit before, but I still think that there's plenty that we can go on. And then after that, we're going to take our holiday break. So yeah, just again, everyone who's here, I really appreciate your time, appreciate your attention. I appreciate your support very, very much. And it's always good to see my friends here. Hope you learned something today. If you have any questions, any comments, any concerns, anything to add at all, you can do that in the comments. And please look at my community tab for more news on, what I'm going to be doing in the next, for next week and then after the holidays. And yeah, if I don't see you before then, I just want to wish everybody a happy holidays. Of course, I will wish you another one happy holidays next week. But if for some reason you don't catch that, just a happy holidays now. And as always, in case I don't see you, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.